Like all other previous screencasts, we have the virtual machines that runs a Solaris 11 graphical user interface, which is what I've just powered on, installed using the live media installation. And there is another instance of Solaris 11 operating system which I'm powering on now, that's installed using the text media of Solaris 11 operating system. Both of them are of version 11.3, and in this episode we would try to configure one of those machines as the OpenLDAP server, and then the maybe the text-based installation that you currently see, we would use this as an LDAP server, and the GUI-based virtual machine that we have, we would use as an LDAP client. So we have the text version of the Solaris up and running now. Let's log in and maybe run a couple of commands to identify what version of Solaris 11 we are using, exactly the release of Solaris 11 we are using. This is not a recommended practice to stay as a root user, but for the sake of convenience, just like the previous video screencast, we would stay as root. And as you can see, we are running 11.3 release of the Solaris 11 x86 version. So this is a text-based Solaris 11 operating system that we have. We would also look at whether the OpenLDAP server is a part of the Solaris 11 base installation or not. As you can see, it's in a disabled state, but it's available as a part of the default installation, and also the IP address of this machine is 192.168.0.100. We could also verify whether we have the OpenLDAP schema. Most of the schemas that are required for OpenLDAP are available by default, but in our episode we might have to use some additional schema as well. We would not be getting into the details of the schema or the attributes of the class in the OpenLDAP. There are other screencasts for the same. And now I just wanted to verify that my etc host has entry for the GUI based Solaris machine that we would now be accessing. So there we have the GUI based Solaris 11 operating system, which we plan to use as an LDAP client during this episode. Let's log in, and then we would take a connection to the S11 server from here. Let's open a terminal. We would run the same commands here to identify what relays of Solaris 11 we are running, maybe by using the pkg command itself to start with. Let's say pkg info kernel, and as you can see from the output, we are running 11.3 relays of the Solaris 11 operating system. We can confirm the same by looking at the etc release file as well. We would also see if our IP address, you can see there are two IP addresses for this machine, one which would let us connect to the outside world, and the other one is the IP address that can let us connect to the S11 server. And as you can see, S11 server is reachable from this machine. As such, there is no domain name set for this machine, so let's set the domain name as mydomain.com. and I have to mention a word of caution here. From Solaris 11 onwards, you will have to set the domain name using service management facility. So think of this as just a workaround that we are doing only for this episode. But when you do it in actual production environment, you have to modify the service management facility service to set up the domain name. So as you can see, we are connecting to the S11 server as a simple user. This is the machine that we would configure as an LDAP server. Let's set the domain name on this machine as well to mydomain.com. Again, this has to be done by the svc cfg command. There is a service NIS domain that you need to modify to set a domain name, but for the sake of convenience and simplicity, I'm using a workaround for this episode. So the domain name is set. Let's open another tab to connect to the local GUI desktop, which we would use as a LDAP client. And now we'll go back to our Solaris 11 server and start configuring this server as a OpenLDAP server. So this is going to be our LDAP server. Just wanted to show you the main configuration file of the OpenLDAP. This is slapd.conf, and as you can see, this file is only pointing to one schema. Schema is what defines the object classes and the attributes that can be used. So that one schema alone is not sufficient for us to get through with this exercise. So as you can see, inside the schema directory of the LDAP server, there are additional schema as well. But one of the schemas that we need is not available by default, so we will create that schema, sudo.schema, and then probably copy that from a sample schema file that's available on the internet. So I've opened a sample sudo.schema file that's available from the Apple website, and let's copy and paste that across to the sudo.schema file that we have just created. For more details on OpenLDAP schema, attributes and object classes, there are a number of screencasts that I've created under the OpenLDAP playlist. I strongly recommend you have a look at it in case if you're interested. So we have the sudo.schema. The next step, of course, is to include all of these schema in the slapd.conf file, which happens to be our OpenLDAP configuration file. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's navigate to the slapd.conf file. Currently slapd.conf file only has core.schema as a part of it, so we will go ahead and include the rest of the schema as well. By the way, since this is going to be a time-consuming activity that may not be of interest to you, I would probably add a couple of those lines and then pause and complete that exercise and come back to you once all the schema is added. Okay, so we have all the schema included as a part of the slapd.conf file. There are a couple of additional changes that we are expected to do in this file. And by the way, the directory that is of interest to us when it comes to OpenLDAP is /var OpenLDAP. That's where we would have the LDAP data stored. The directory may not exist, so you may have to create it if it doesn't exist, and you may have to assign the right honors for those directory, which is the OpenLDAP user. The other thing that you may want to keep in mind is that to control access to the data in the directory, you'll have to define access control. Now if you don't define access control, by default anonymous access is available. And the domain name that we plan to use is my domain, so we will change the suffix accordingly. And for the top level administrator, which is CN is equal to manager, we have a password that's secret by default. Let's change that to one of my favorites, which is, let's say, can get in. So that's going to be the password for CN is equal to manager user. Just keep in mind that this is the directory where OpenLDAP -data, where the LDAP data would be stored. Again, by default this directory may not exist, so you will have to create it and assign the right ownership to this directory for the LDAP server to start successfully. So let's save the file and create the directory if it doesn't exist. We'll try and create var OpenLDAP -data. Okay, so I had tried this some time back, so the directory exists. Maybe we would just clean up the OpenLDAP directory, make sure that we have the right ownership there. This directory is owned by OpenLDAP user and OpenLDAP group. That's very important. If the ownership is not correct, then you would not be able to successfully start the OpenLDAP server. Let's verify whether OpenLDAP server service is enabled or not. As you can see from the status, it's disabled. Now I'm going to enable that. Okay, so we have the OpenLDAP server hopefully running by this time. Let's see whether the OpenLDAP server it's online. So we are good. In fact, we have started OpenLDAP server without much of a problem. The only change we have made is actually adding the schema to the default slapd.conf file, the schema that is required to configure Solaris as an LDAP client. What I'm trying to do now is to perform a search operation on the root suffix of the OpenLDAP, which is my domain /com. In fact, such a root suffix does not exist, so most likely this command is going to give me an error that says object not found. No surprise there, because we do not have a root suffix dc is equal to my domain comma dc is equal to com, so we expected this error. So what we will do is, I have a LDIF file which is root data.ldif. In the interest of time, I've pre-populated it with data. Let's have a look at it. So as you can see, the first segment of that file will create a root suffix which is my domain dc-com. Now what's important when you configure this with Solaris is that the object class NIS domain object and my domain NIS domain attribute has to be there. Below the dc is equal to my domain comma dc is equal to com, we have another container called ou is equal to profile. Similarly, there is another container ou is equal to SUDOERS, because we plan to have sudo also kept inside the LDAP server rather than using this local sudo file in the Solaris box. There is a user shomes, let me highlight that user, who is going to get sudo access in all the hosts, and that user is able to run all the commands. Now that's another container by the name ou is equal to people under my domain com, and then there is ou is equal to group. Again, if you're not familiar with the directory information tree or the LDIF, I'd strongly recommend you please have a look at the playlist OpenLDAP, which will give you a complete picture on what does LDIF does. So it creates a tree structure in the OpenLDAP with dc is equal to my domain comma dc is equal to com as a root suffix. Under that you have containers like ou is equal to profile, ou is equal to group, ou is equal to users. What I'm highlighting now is a profile by the name test profile. This is going to be used by the LDAP clients, and as you can see, the server that I've highlighted is actually the S11-server, which would act as an LDAP server. And then you can also see where each of these services are located. As an example, SUDOERS service is going to be located in a container called ou is equal to SUDOERS. So this is the tree structure, and there is one user that we would eventually create in the directory server, which is shomes, my favorite user, Sherlock Holmes. You would remember that Sherlock Holmes also has sudo access for all the commands in all the hosts. So we would be creating this user as well. And finally, the last segment in this LDIF file is a password policy. Again, if you're not familiar with the password policy in an LDAP server, I'd strongly recommend you watch the password policy segment of the OpenLDAP playlist that I have. I'm now adding the data into the LDAP server by using this LDIF file. You remember the top level administrator of the OpenLDAP is cn is equal to manager. I'm pointing that to a file data.ldif. It's prompting me for the password, can get in. Oops, so something has gone wrong. It says value number 3 is invalid per syntax. Let's have a look at what is value number 3, data.ldif. So 0 is top, 1 is DC object, 2 is organization. So value number 3 is NIS domain object. Now apparently NIS domain object is not a part of any of the schema that we have already included in the OpenLDAP. In fact, I've added now a new schema called Solaris.schema. In the background, I browsed away to figure out a sample Solaris.schema file which includes this object class in the attribute. So I plan to use this schema. We had not included this schema in the slapd.conf earlier, and because these object classes like NIS domain object and NIS domain attribute do not exist, attempt to dump the data into the LDAP server failed. Let's open the file, or maybe I'll clear the Solaris.schema file, whatever that file content is. Open Solaris.schema new file and paste the contents that I just copied from the website there, which is a sample Solaris.schema. Mind you, I'm doing this so that we have access to the NIS domain object class and the NIS domain attribute. So we now have a new schema that we have added to the OpenLDAP, but it's not sufficient that we put this file inside the schema directory. We have to make sure that we include this schema in the slapd.conf file. So let's add the schema Solaris.schema also as a part of the slapd.conf. Any change to that would require a server restart. There are ways in OpenLDAP where you can do this without a server restart, but that's a story for another day. We don't have the time for that. So let's disable and enable the LDAP server so that the new schema that we have added takes effect. Again, there are ways where you can modify these things on the fly. It's called online configuration in LDAP server, but that is out of the scope of this particular episode. So we will try now. By the way, there is one more thing that I figured out in the data.ldif file. The user password attribute, the value pwd attribute is user password. Now you can use this attribute value only if you add a line in the slapd.conf, and that's what I'm now doing. If I don't do this, attempt to add the data into the LDAP server will fail. So I have to add a module called password policy overlay. So let me add that module here. Again, I have to tell you this one more time. If I do not do this, the attribute value pwd attribute will throw an error if when I attempt to import that data into the LDAP server. So looks like I've added the required entry. Like I mentioned previously, any change to the slapd.conf file will require you to restart the LDAP server, which is what I'm doing. Again, you can do that without a restart also using the online configuration of OpenLDAP, but we're not discussing that now. So looks like we have done what is required. Let's try to import the data from data.ldif file. We'll one more time verify the content of this LDAP file, and then we will import the data into the LDAP server using the LDAP add command that we observed some time back. So that's the user which we would be creating, and finally this is the password policy, and the user password attribute would have thrown an error if we had not added that entry in the slapd.conf. Let's try adding this. Supply the password. Oh, looks like most of the entries were imported except the password policy. So it says that there are some problems with a couple of attributes. We can fix it, but I'd prefer not to fix every single error that comes out of the password policy, because that's not what we want. But at least the entry did not go through because I missed adding a line in the slapd.conf, which is what I'm doing now, adding a line for the password policy overlay. So let me do that. Again, if you want more details about this password policy overlay in OpenLDAP, there are other segments, video segments, which can do this. Change in slapd.conf. I am disabling and enabling the OpenLDAP server one more time. Let's see if it is online. LDAP server is online. Now let's edit the file. The reason why I'm editing this is most of the other entries were imported into the directory server, so we will remove all those entries from this file, and we will just keep the password policy as the only entry to be imported. So I have removed rest of the entries from this file. I've included only the password policy entry here. Now let's try adding the password policy entry into the LDAP server. Oops, we have some other error which says there is some problem with the pwd max age. You know, we can spend time fixing this, but I don't want to do that because this is not the priority that we are focusing on in this episode. So I'll remove these two attributes from the password policy, pwd max age also, probably because we don't want to spend too much of time fixing this issue. Let's save the file and import the password policy into the LDAP server. So let's see if it goes through fine. Looks like we have now added the data into the LDAP server. Let's do a search. We are searching using the bind DN of the top level administrator, which is manager, and we will use the base DN where you want to start the search. That's my domain dc is equal to com, and let's get all the data. That means every entry that has object class in it. So now we are not looking at the data.ldif file, we are actually getting the data from the LDAP server itself. So we have the data in the LDAP server. Onto the client, let's see if we are able to reach the LDAP server or not. So sl11-server.domain.com is reachable. We'll try to perform a search to see if we are able to get access to the data in the LDAP server. Let's connect to the port number 389, bind ourselves as cn is equal to manager, dc is equal to my domain, and specify the base dn as dc is equal to my domain, dc is equal to com. You know, we're just trying to reach out to the LDAP server from the client and see if you're able to access the data in the LDAP server. So we get the data from the LDAP server, so LDAP server is reachable. And of course we have set the domain name already. We can just verify that and see the domain name is accessible. Let's take a look at the OpenLDAP naming service. In fact, naming service is also a service management facility service, and if we list the properties of the name service switch, this used to be the /etc nsswitch.conf in the previous versions of Solaris. You can see the properties of the name service switches showing us files all over, meaning for naming resolution, look at the local files on this machine rather than contacting a centralized location like LDAP server. That's what it means. So for everything, look at the local files. That's how it is currently configured. We will need to change it, and of course a recommended way to change this in Solaris 11 operating system is by modifying the properties of this service name service /switch. But just so that we don't complicate things, I would go to the etc directory and list down the old configuration file, which is nsswitch.conf. nsswitch.conf is actually the configuration file for the naming service. It's no longer the case. It has to be managed using SMF, but then there are ways which we can modify these files and then import the file into the service management facility. So I'm looking at a sample file which is .files. There is also another sample file called .ldap, nsswitch.ldap, which can be used as a configuration file if you want this machine to contact LDAP server for centralized naming service. We will look at a naming service configuration file, which is nsswitch.conf. Currently, as you can see, it's all pointing towards files. Ideally, you should not be modifying this file. You should be modifying the properties of SMF, but for the sake of simplicity, what I'm doing is I'm copying the let's take a backup before I copy. I'm copying the nsswitch.ldap to etc nsswitch.conf file. So let's copy etc nsswitch.ldap to etc nsswitch.conf. Now this would mean that for resolutions like user authentication, naming services, all this, it will contact the LDAP server, and if it doesn't find or if it is not able to reach the LDAP server, it will look at the local files. I need to add one entry for SUDOERS. I'm doing that. So what I'm trying to say is for SUDOERS also, please contact the LDAP server. Now this file has to be imported into the service management facility. There is a command for that, which is nscfg, and then we do the import to the name service switch. Little rusty with this command. Yeah, it's failed. It's actually nscfg import and then the fmri, which is name-service/switch. So let's do an import of this file. So what it'll do is it'll import the nsswitch.conf file to the service management facility name service switch. Let's verify if the SMF properties have changed by running the command. Again, if you're not familiar with service management facility in Solaris 11, I'd recommend watching the service management facility episode in the playlist Solaris. Okay, looks like it's not changed. Maybe I would look at it again. No, the LDAP entry is not there in the service. So what we will do now is probably forcibly import it. Let's do a -f option here, which will make sure that the etc nsswitch.conf is imported into the name service switch service management facility. Let's verify that. Yes, you can see that. For every entry there is an LDAP label also, meaning that etc sudoers, you should contact the LDAP server. Let's verify the nsswitch.conf one more time. So this is the file that has been imported into the ns name service/switch SMF. Okay, so we are good, and now probably we can just configure this machine as an LDAP client. So before we do that, I'm just modifying a couple of entries in this file. Hosts should resolve itself to DNS or local files. Similarly, IP nodes also should resolve to DNS or the local files. So we'll remove those LDAP entries, and as you might rightly guess, once I make changes to this file, I'm expected to import this file into the service management facility, which is name service/switch. So let's import that. sorry, the F is in the wrong place. Let's change that and import this file into the service management facility name service/switch. Okay, so looks like we have done the bit. Now let's run the client command on this. As you can see, the LDAP client is in disabled state now. One more time, let's verify we are able to reach the server or not. It's reachable. I'm running the command LDAP client in init mode. You know, LDAP client command can be run in manual mode and init mode. In manual mode, you're expected to specify every single parameter. Here I'm expecting the LDAP client to pick up a profile from the LDAP server and configure itself. So you would remember in the LDAP server we had placed a profile for the LDAP clients, the profile that included the name of the LDAP server that it can contact, the proxy user information, etc. That's the profile name I'm specifying. You remember there was a test profile that we added into the LDAP server, and then finally LDAP server name. We verified that it resolves to LDAP server, so let's hit enter and you can see it's being configured. So the Solaris machine is now being configured as an LDAP client. Let's wait for the configuration to successfully complete. Looks like the configuration went through quite fine, meaning we did everything correctly. Now let's verify whether we are able to contact the LDAP server or not. So just to show you the output of the LDAP client command, the way it picked up the profile file from the LDAP server and start configuring the required files on the LDAP client. You can see that here. There you go. You can see it's downloading a profile from the LDAP server, and then it started configuring. The proxy agent is the user who would be interacting with LDAP server regularly, and it has a password. You can see that it's an encrypted format there. So looks like we are good to go. Our machine is configured as an LDAP client. We can verify whether we are able to fetch data from the LDAP server or not. There are commands that can be used to figure out whether LDAP server is configured successfully or not. Just one more time, let's scroll down to see if everything is fine and that we don't have any errors in the output there. Okay, let's clear the screen and then run the LDAP list command. Oops, there is some issue there. We are not able to get. Let's verify whether we are able to get users from the LDAP server. We had a user by the name sholmes. Let's see if no, the sholmes is not. So we are not very clearly we're not able to reach the LDAP server. Let's look at the var_adm messages and see what could be the problem there. Okay, all the messages are leading us to conclude that there is some problem with the credential. The credential of the proxy agent is what they mean by this. You know, the proxy agent is the one who regularly interacts with the LDAP server. Let's search and see if there is any credential for the proxy agent. So I am querying the LDAP server now as a top level, or maybe, you know, I'm just trying an anonymous access to the profile there to verify, you know, what kind of authentication is defined in the test profile. You remember test profile is what we are using. This client is using the test profile to contact the LDAP server. So it's a simple authentication method. So that's basically the proxy username and the password. Let's do one thing. Let us reset the password of the proxy agent. Remember we mentioned the password while configuring the LDAP client using the init option. So we will do one thing. We will reset the password of the proxy agent to that of the password there. If you're not familiar with the LDAP modify command, I'd recommend you to please watch the segment around LDAP modify in the OpenLDAP playlist. What we are doing is we are modifying an entry which is proxy agent user information. So we are modifying that. That's the DN where we want the modification take effect. And what change do we want? We want a modify. I mean, we are not adding an entry, we are modifying an entry. And what are we modifying? We are replacing an attribute user password, and the user password is going to be set to a value of password for the user proxy agent. So let's now see if we are getting any additional errors in the var_adm messages or not. If the password is true, then we should be able to get output for the LDAP list command. So no evidence in the var_adm messages that says there are continuous error messages. So let's come out and see LDAP list command. Hooray. So we have it. I think we are able to get to the LDAP server without a problem. So that is fine. Let's run the PAM. If we want the users to be authenticated using the LDAP server, there are a couple of modifications that are required in the pluggable authentication module. That's what we are doing now. We are modifying the PAM.d. The idea is that I want to let the Solaris client know that the user also needs to be authenticated against an LDAP server. It's not just with the local machine that the user need to be authenticated. LDAP server also needs to be contacted, and then probably we can look at the user SHOMS and see if the user is accessible or not. Again, it's outside the scope of this particular episode to discuss in detail what we are doing here in the PAM. Probably the simplest way I can put is that all I'm doing is that I am letting this Solaris client know that the user authentication also needs to be performed against an LDAP server. So let's modify. There are two files that I've modified. One is the etc pam.d login, and the one that I'm modifying now is /etc pam.d/other. So let me add one more entry at the bottom of this, which will require this machine also to contact an LDAP server for authenticating the user. Changes to these files requires a server restart. So let's do one thing. Let's clear the screen and shut down the machine. Let's do a restart of this machine. We will use the graceful way of doing it. Shut down minus no grace time. Let's shut it down completely. We'll have to wait for this machine to come up so that we could verify whether the LDAP client has been successfully configured. In fact, LDAP client has been successfully configured. Now what we are trying to do is to verify whether the users are able to authenticate themselves against an LDAP server. So let's start it again. Power on the S11 desktop. Hit enter to the default Solaris-1 boot environment. We will establish connection to the S11 server. Once this is up, we will work on it remotely from the S11 desktop. The idea is to verify whether the user SHOMS is able to access this Solaris LDAP client or not. Let's log in as a simple user. We don't have the root logins enabled for the Solaris boxes directly on the console, so let's log in as a simple user. Open a terminal and then first establish a connection to the S11 server so that we have access to the server from the desktop itself. Let's do an SSH to the S11-server. Okay, supply the password. Stay as a root user, not recommended, but for convenience we will do that in this demonstration. We'll open another tab possibly to run commands on the LDAP client. So let's open another tab here. SU as a root user, again not recommended, but for convenience we'll do that in this episode. We'll verify whether we are able to access the user or not. And by the way, you have to keep in mind that so the user is available. We'll try to do, since the user does not have a home directory, in fact you can create a home directory and auto mount it. I was able to get the user, but the user does not have any home directory. See again one more time, you have SHOMS, and maybe I will do one thing. I'll switch user as a simple user and then try to SU to SHOMS so that it prompts me for a password. There you go. I'm now SHOMS. Let's verify that by using the ID. Now we might want to test this. Let's go back to the server, Solaris 11 server, and then shut down our LDAP server. It's currently online. Let's shut it down. Let's disable the LDAP/server just to verify whether you are able to SU to SHOMS. Remember, SHOMS is on the LDAP server, so ideally you shouldn't be able to SU to SHOMS. We would expect an error here, and that's right, unknown ID, obviously because SHOMS is on the LDAP server. Let's go back and enable the LDAP server. Let's enable LDAP server and now come back and verify if we are able to switch user to SHOMS or not. Prompts me for the password. I supply the SHOMS password and there you go, I am shomes now. So good, the user is also working fine. Now is the next step. Let's see whether shomes has sudo access or not. So we will do that by running the command sudo -l minus capital U shomes, and it says, you know, shomes does not have sudo access. By the way, Solaris 11 bundles sudo as a part of it, which is under usr bin sudo directory. What I've done is I've opened the sudo website, and I'm downloading the tarballs for the sudo. I'm going to install a custom sudo here. Basically, I don't want the sudo that is packaged as a part of the Solaris 11. Let me save that into the downloads location. It's a very small file. Let's confirm where it is saved. Okay, so we have it under the download section. Let's go to the downloads section, unzip and untar this file. Let's cd to export home and the username, and then downloads location. Let's unzip this. So again, we have a sudo that is packaged as a part of Solaris 11. We don't plan to use it, so we are using custom sudo. Now let's build this sudo package. We'll run the configure command with prefix. I want this sudo command to be located under usr local sudo, and I want the sudo to use LDAP. The LDAP configuration file is etc sudo.ldap. That is what I want the sudo to use as an LDAP configuration file. What it contains you will see very soon. Let's run the command and see. Okay, I think there is a syntax error there. There is also an error that says I don't have a C compiler on this machine. Okay, so what I'll do is, well, let's install C compiler. By the way, this is image packaging system in Solaris 11. pkg install gcc. It contacts an image packaging system repository and downloads the package. Again, if you're not familiar with image packaging system in Solaris 11, there are a couple of videos in the Solaris playlist that discusses about the image packaging system. So I'm installing the gcc so that it can be compiled and sudo package can be created under usr local directory. Let's wait for the installation of the GCC to conclude, and after that we will go ahead and run the configure command one more time. There was also a problem with one of the parameters in the command. We will fix that as well when we run the configure command. So let's see if GCC installation goes through fine. Okay, looks like there was no problem getting those packages down from the IPS repository, and now it's going through the installation phase. Let's wait for the installation to conclude, and immediately we would run the configure command again to configure the sudo. I would assume that there was a mistake in one of the parameters in the command. Let's clear the screen and run the configure command again. Okay, so the parameter is with LDAP conf -files. Let's clean that up and now run the command. So it's now configuring fine. Nice, looks like it's going through just fine. We'll wait for this process to complete, then we'll run make and make install to complete the installation of the sudo from the source code. Okay, so that's also done. Let's run the make command, and then we will follow this up with make install. That will complete the sudo installation under the usr local sudo. Remember, the default sudo that exists in Solaris 11 is actually under usr bin, and we have to override that. We don't want to use the default sudo. We want to use the sudo that we are installing from the tarballs. So we will have to modify the path also once the installation is through, making sure that every time a user runs the sudo command, the command is picked up from usr local sudo bin directory rather than the usr bin directory, which is where the default sudo is located. So once we are through with this, we will also set the path. And again, I'm setting the path only on the terminal after this. But if you want that to persist across a reboot, you will have to put those path details in appropriate files like /etc/profile. Again, I have to remind you that some of the things that I did in this episode are just workarounds A classic example is the domain name. I set the domain name using domain name command, and then in the file /et is a default domain. That's not the way you should be doing. You should be modifying the service management facility and IS/domain. Okay, now let's run the make command to complete the installation of the sudo under the make install. Let's finish that off. So not going to take much time for sure. Let's wait for this operation to conclude. Okay, good. Let's clear the screen, and now we will set the path in a way that when I run the sudo command, first it will look up the directory usr local sudo bin. We can verify that which sudo should show you that. Good. Now let's see if shomes has access to sudo or not. Let's run the command sudo. Before that, let's show you sudo.ldap has details about the LDAP server, and also the container of the LDAP server where the sudo is stored. Sudo -u username is shomes in C. Now you can see that we have a different output. Sherlock Holmes is able to run all commands on all boxes, including the Solaris box. Let's run the most damaging command probably. We will su to shomes. Ideally shomes should not be able to shut down the machine, but we can verify that, and as you can see, shomes is indeed able to shut down the machine. Let's proceed with the shutdown, and that concludes this episode. Thank you for watching this.